Resson is a practitioner in conservation, and she has been in that space for a while, having practiced this in reality when it comes to sustainability and conservation. And at the same space, we are also having Irene Moke, who's also a conservationist, but a scholar as well in that space. And when you're thinking about what has practically happened, what has been done, what could happen, I'd like to invite these two to just share the experiences in how the whole conversation about decoloniality in practice looks like, in terms of what they have done in their work, and at the same time, what it looks like for them to work in that space on practicing conservation and sustainability issues in their respective work. So, Resson and Irene.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and having us. This has been a very, very interesting discussion, and also very thought-provoking from people who I'd say very sadly represent the bottom. I say sadly because we are also people who have studied, as Matthew was saying, have had first, second, and some third degrees, and so there are places in which we should not be sitting here to represent people who are living on the ground, and for us living closest to the resources that we work with every day. I work in lion conservation, and so does Irene. And I want to come at this from an article that we put together because we have started to think about these issues. We are not privy to these spaces that exist in the research world. So we've come at this from maybe a more practical place where we see human-wildlife conflict continuing to happen. And as conservationists, we are constantly addressing this. And it is only a symptom of the wider problems that you have all taken very much time to explain and expound on in this conversation. And for us, I think I want to challenge all of you as researchers, because I personally am not a researcher. I am a practitioner through and through. And research itself has historical roots, and its historical roots are, especially on this continent, are in exploration, where African bodies were either part of that exploration or used to further these efforts. So we watch this. We've watched the fact that, for 100 and more years, the colonial project has continued to be to separate Africans from wildlife as a rule. The exclusion of people, not only from wild spaces, but from the decision-making tables, where the things that matter very much to them they are not privy to a lot of that, which is why I feel very sad to be representing them sitting here. So I was privileged to be part of a group of women from 14 different African countries, and we came together along with allies, and I'm grateful that the allies have been mentioned several times in this conversation already, that to provide a road to recovery for some of the microaggressions that we face practically in the field that are to do with this power that is being discussed. And this is basically our first attempts to figure out what decolonization of the conservation movement looks like. I don't know if I have the ability to share my screen.
Yes,
we wrote an article in November. Great, perfect. We wrote an article in November to just provide some very, very simple, practical examples of what these sorts of power dynamics are. They come in the simplest forms, but they really have the power to wound, and they have the power to completely disempower people who are working in conservation. So I just wanted to share a few of these examples very, very quickly. The article came out in Mongabe, and it is called A Road to Recovery for Subtle Racism in Conservation. This very simple example is basically about a woman who was, the linchpin in solving a major problem in her community. But because she is a traditionally dressed woman, she's not given any of the privilege that she, not just privilege, but any of what is needed on her end, the recognition that she is actually the fulcrum of this issue. She is the one who has solved the conflict, but everybody else looks at her as just a traditional woman. And this brings into question the idea of who the community is. And I think very often, especially as researchers, it's a challenge that I would always like to give researchers, because research is still king over local people. Science is still paramount and is still constantly referred to as the most important thing when it comes to sustainability and solving some of the major problems that we face on the ground. And so it disempowers the people who are doing practical conservation work in this particular case. There is always a distinction. And this also brings in the power of language. When you call some people conservationists and others local community stakeholders or just the community, that in itself is a way of disempowering. So we wanted to just provide a simple practical example about that, about the fact that there should not be that distinction. And, as Laura referred to infiltrating spaces and these echelons, the use of language is so important as we go to do these things, because it continues to disempower people every day who are involved in sustainability and in conservation. This is an example that I believe has probably gone around, and I don't know if you've spent any time discussing this in your previous forums, but Asha DeVos wrote about parachute science in great detail last year and in other years, and I know quite a few others have been writing about parachute science, and I think I won't spend very much time on this example, because I think that the whole discussion that we've had until this point really refers to this. It refers to the fact that, because of the flawed workings of academia, the local scientists, the local themselves are completely shunted aside. It's not science unless it is witnessed by Western eyes. Consent, participation, acknowledgement, these are things that we're still wrestling with in 2021 in research in all sorts of fields, not just conservation. And this is really important. I don't know if Irene, you'd like to jump in now before I move on to something else.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Resson, for setting the stage, and thank you so much, everyone, and the previous panelists. I think one of the things that I kept asking myself as we listened to the previous panelists was, what sort of power do I, as a researcher, as a conservationist, have when I go out to work? Pretty much like Matthew, when I am going out to collect my data, do I recognize that I'm in a position of power, and how do I use, that power? And I think a couple of examples that come to mind that touch on what, Resson has spoken about in her two examples, and, also what the other panelists talked about was, when you go on the ground, and like Matthew says, when the community asked, what do you want from us? The question that came to mind was that, does the power we have as researchers interfere with our findings when the community that we talk to, or, the people who maybe we think of as marginalized, ask us that question? Do we then go back and think, okay, we've had these questionnaires and surveys, are the results we're having really reflection of what's happening on the ground? Because, working in the field, we've experienced, a lot of research fatigue, and talking to people who will say, at the end of the day, I'm telling you what I know you want to hear. So are we actually collecting data that is reflective of what's on the ground, or data that these groups of people that we're engaging with are giving us and telling us so that we can go away and, stop disturbing them? So, at the end of the day, are we actually making an impact? The cartoon on one of Joel's slides, say the more inaccessible the study, the greater the impact. Is this really what's happening, or are we setting up ourselves for failure? I think then, going back to Resson's last slide, where you're looking at parachute research, where unless it's been discovered by someone very far removed from, the group on the ground, it's not considered as important. I mean, something that's, very real is when you look at the field of botany, a lot of money is being spent looking at cures, and, traditional knowledge is not being tapped into. And a lot of this is in a way dying out. When you look at medicinal plants, talking to, communities, why is it that we don't listen and value what they have? Why don't we value the knowledge that's been passed through generations? And, in a way, we are reinventing the wheel. We're just reinventing the wheel using very, difficult words. But all this is stuff, and these are things that are already known. So I think as researchers and as, I guess, even practitioners, we need to start thinking, can we step away from this power that we have, that we may not even know that we have, and actually listen and be keen? And, going back to Matthew's question, are we just going around in circles? When are we actually going to stop, talking about all the issues and start acting and paying attention to the people who've been in these spaces longer than us? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I'd also just like to maybe end by referring again to Joel's slide about the inaccessibility, and challenging everybody who's on this call, who is involved in research, a challenge from those of us who are not involved in, well, our organization is involved in applied research, but we're not involved in research in the same way and in the same depth and breadth in which many of you are. And, it's about this accessibility of the things that you're doing, of even just this very discourse to, the people who are actually on the ground living these realities. I don't think there is an awareness that these discussions are happening in any practical setting. And there isn't also an awareness for a lot of people of their own agency and their own place. So, part of why we wrote this article, why we came together with all the women that I mentioned, was to just try and give this a very practical space, and to make sure that it is as accessible to anybody who's able to read and write and can pass this sort of information along, so that we create more power and we create more agency, because we are creating that new level of awareness. And I do hope that this discussion, as it carries on, will also help, lead into that accessibility, because I do believe that inaccessibility has curtailed a lot of the progress that I think all of us would like to see in sustainability, where everybody feels they have agency, they have a place in this story, they have some level of power. Because I don't believe decolonization will be able to happen unless there is far more inclusion of local voices and of the people who are, closest to this resource.
And yeah, I think just to add on to what Resson has said, I think a challenge to this group, and it's very academic, and as Resson said, the two of us are practitioners. I would like to see dialogue being used to shift, the power bases. How can we, or how can you, this group, as academics who've studied decolonization and have had these discussions, how can you then bring it to the ground, to the very grassroots, to that basic unit of what you're talking about? And, how can you use dialogue to shift this power? So for me, that's the challenge that, I'm setting for all of you. And I would like to see this kind of discussion in spaces where there are more practitioners, being involved and being asked to give their opinion, so that we actually have, techniques that can be used so that it's not a talk shop. So, we've talked, so let's go and change it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Resson. Thanks, Irene, for those very insightful comments and actually giving, what would you say, food to the whole body, because then we have to talk about actual things that are happening. A lot of things are emerging, what's the role of everybody here in pushing towards, decoloniality, for example, or challenging power in that space when it comes to methods. How are we dealing with resource governance constraints, or rather, is it about resource governance issues or more about the challenges of decoloniality, even if it's a need? The politics of knowledge, this is very interesting. In the end, you've talked about agency, and Irene, when you're talking about agency and Resson, everybody being able to have power and challenging the participants in this conversation to open up that space for conversation and thinking about dialogue that involves more people, or rather practitioners, as well as potential researchees, if we could call them that.